So let's talk about the Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey case. All right. So I've been watching behavioral analysis videos about Stephen Avery. I wanted to find some of the same analysis looking at Brendan Dassey, but I couldn't really find anything. All right. Now, what's interesting about that, I did a video doing the same thing that they're doing, right? Um, by using their logic, while Brendan was complying with the detectives, giving them a false narrative, that from information that he was being fed, he was exhibiting the same behaviors that they say are indicators of deception. Touching his face, looking, you know, all kinds of things like that, right? I don't remember exactly everything that I said in that video because it's been some time ago. All right. Uh, but there were obvious signs of deception if you believe in body language like they do. You know what I'm saying? Um, Here's what I think about it. I think it is the same thing as the lie detector test. It is exactly the same thing. It is basically looking for the same thing, which is anxiety, right? The problem with that, there's many reasons why someone might have anxiety. Nervousness about being questioned, nervousness about thinking, they're going to think I did this, even though I know I didn't, right? So there's a lot of good reasons why a suspect might feel anxious. And that is why, lie detector tests aren't reliable. And that's also why body language analysis isn't that reliable. But it can be helpful. All right. Not saying it's just total bunk, there's nothing to it, because there is. They can get an idea into the personality of a person, but getting an idea, right? It is not written in concrete, so that is something I think that everyone needs to understand about this, especially, the experts, which is what we have here. I mean, without a doubt, these guys are, you know, well trained in this field. All right. Um, and, as a matter of fact, that's how they started, by giving out their credentials. Right. Um, but what they have to understand is that this is not an exact science. And I believe they even say that in this video. Right. This is not an exact science. This is, for me, I think this is educated guesswork, right? It is looking for patterns that can give you an idea. And as a matter of fact, when they are analyzing his behavior, they say it could be this, or it could be that, right? There's no one thing that they're going to say, oh, this is definitely that. Like, there's nothing else that would correlate to that behavior, right? So I think that's something really important we should consider. All right. Um, the other, we're going to look at another video that's way better than this. All right. Um, we're only going to watch a few minutes of this because it's really long, and I've watched the whole thing. All right. I'm going to go to the most important parts. Two specific parts, right, is what we're going to talk about.
her employer. This happens to be Stephen Avery, and it's raw footage. We just pulled something other than what's being used on the Netflix show, and that we are only going to analyze this. We may bring up some points about interrogation and that as we go, but it's only about this raw footage, and one of the first times that Stephen Avery is seen in any kind of connection with this case. Does that help?
Yeah, perfect. Chase, you had something you want to say as well, I think. Or did you?
I was going to say a few things about the interrogation, but maybe we can bring that in as we get into it.
Yep. I think there's a good opportunity later when we're talking about the Dassey interrogation. It's important we talk about some.
Excellent. Mark, what were you going to say?
Yeah, so I just want to say that, you know, my guess is that everybody out there knows about this Stephen Avery case. I didn't know about it. First time I saw any, and people have said before about the Amanda Knox thing. Mark, you must have heard about this. I've been living in Canada for the last 15 years. I clearly don't watch the TV that you watch. Sorry about it. I didn't know about Amanda Knox. I didn't know about this. So in both cases, it's the first time that I'm seeing this footage. That could be helpful. Maybe it won't be. All of you will know more about this than I do. But maybe what you don't have is the fresh eyes on it and no framework other than what you see right there. That's all I've looked at.
You know, Mark,
That is a great point. However, he's sitting there with, as far as I can tell, 3 other people who are already biased against Stephen Avery. Okay. Now, I'm going to be looking for something in here. I'm going to do an analysis on these guys. Okay. There's something really critical that happens. And I want to see if his opinion changes after something critical happens. You see what I'm saying? I think that might be the case, but I don't remember exactly the order of everything that happened.
I had never watched the Netflix show, didn't know who it was. When I start looking for video, I say, okay, what's hot? I'll go out and look, and when you start looking, this is a hot one. So I started looking and started digging into this case and realizing, wow, this is really a mess. This guy was convicted wrongfully of rape, spent 18 years in prison, got out, and then 2 years later, he's accused of this crime.
Yeah. But it's a great piece of video.
It is.
Yeah. And I think it's good because we're not here to prove innocence or guilt or anything like that. We're just looking at this piece of film and saying, or piece of video and saying, look, here's what we see. And as we do this, we're not on the side of guilt or the side of innocence. We're going to say, look, we see deception and we see it here, here, and here. And we'll see truth. We'll say we see truth in it here, here, and here. That's all we're doing. We're not trying to, we don't know the backstory. Greg knows all about the backstory of the case and all that. I don't know that much about the backstory either.
I don't know if I know it all. This is a long one.
I didn't even know who this guy was. I had to call Greg.
Yep. I sent the video to Scott. Scott sent the video out, and I started getting text. Who is this guy? And I said, apparently Stephen Avery. And so even as late as today, I was digging up information. This is a long, complicated case. And there's a reason the stuff we're talking about is on Netflix, and it's complicated, and people are looking to try to get resolution because it's a mess of a story, the same as the Amanda Knox or any of these others.
Exactly.
But as you go through the video here, just keep in mind, we're not analyzing the case, we're analyzing the clip.
Great point. Yeah.
Exactly. And another thing, when we're giving each other, it sounds like we're giving each other tips on body language. We're not. We're talking to the one person who wants to watch this, to the viewer who says, I'm going to learn something about body language or human behavior. That's the person we're talking to. So that's what we're doing. I'm not giving Greg, let me tell you how to interrogate a damn terrorist, man. Here's the way it goes down. Or Chase or a Mark, either one. I'm not telling anybody that. But
you do pick up signals from the rest of the panel. You know what I'm saying? That's what we're going to look at today. All right. I want to see what signals each person was sending out to the rest of the panel and see if that may have helped to inflict bias in them. And then they started siding with the idea that he's a psychopath. I think that is what happened.
And none of us are. So that's what we're actually doing is we're telling the person who's watching this. So if you're watching this, hopefully you'll learn something.
I can clarify that Mark is teaching us most of the time.
Listen,
Yeah, no
I'll
kidding.
take all the help I can get from any of you.
See, that's what pros always say. Oh, yeah, I'm just still in the learning process.
I keep saying though, guys, and with all this, and we just keep talking, I hope people are enjoying this much as we are. We started this for us to hang out, and we are learning from each other, and it's a cool thing. It's my favorite part of the week.
Yeah, mine.
Point received. That right there pretty much affirms what I'm saying. They are learning from each other. All right. So if one person has a biased opinion about something, that is eventually going to be received to the rest of the panel. All right. So what I think they should do before any of them starts talking about what they think about a specific clip, they should write down a brief description of what they got out of the clip. And the first thing they would do once they're all done, they would hold up their papers and show what they each wrote. You know, that way, if there are different opinions within the panel, they wouldn't be able to change their opinion based on what the rest of the panel is. All right. There's a name for that. I don't remember what it is. All right. I'm sure someone in the comments will probably tell me. All right. But it is when you agree with the group so that you're not viewed as an outsider. All right. And that's part of bias as well. You're more biased to think it's better if I agree with the group. I'm more vulnerable to be persuaded because the rest of the group sees it this way, right? So I would also like to suggest that every once in a while, one of the panel will look at something a certain way and then say the opposite. Just complete opposite, just completely lie, right? But the panel knows there's going to be some lies within the panel, right? You know, but once they've all weighed in, then they'll each reveal if their analysis was a lie or it was the truth. All right. So maybe that's how they could do it. Instead of writing down initially, they could all weigh in, right? And then they could put up their paper that says if they lied or they told the truth about their analysis. What that would do is it would show, you know, if someone lied and was able to persuade the rest of the panel to change their mind. I think it makes sense. I think that's what happens.
Name feelings. It might be true to say some males may be able to name less feelings than some females, but on the whole, somebody who he knew, you might expect that a feeling might be able to get named. But just as Chase says there, he says, well, you know, it's too close to home, something happening. So there's something happening. Here's something I've learned from Chase there is this distancing element, something happening. That's very unspecific. And just as Chase says there, it's too close to home, which he repeats twice. It's too close to home. Now, again, I want to assure you, I knew nothing about this, but I've got a big emphasis around it's too close to home being said twice. And I found out, I think it was from Chase or Gregory, that there was some evidence found around the home, very close to the home. Anyway.
And at no point did any of them bring up the investigation and how sloppy it was. They are all just assuming the investigation went off without a hitch. There was nothing odd about it. You know, Greg is the one who's supposed to know the most about the case. He doesn't ever mention all of the red flags that were there. You know what I'm saying? So I think that's really odd. And it makes it harder to penalize the rest of the panel, because it's kind of like they were given one side of the story, right? So that's just what I'm thinking so far.
What is most important for me, I think, is the downward bark that he does at the end. So when you clear your throat, on the whole, I would suggest when you're actually trying to get stuff out there, you cough up. Or when you're trying to clear your lungs, you cough up. He coughs down and actually makes a low sound in the lungs. That for me is a primate bark that says, you're going to stop this now. I'm taking control. This is the end of this now. That's what I've got. Scott, what do you got?
This is where
So, the next video we're going to watch is a perfect explanation of a lot of these things, right? What they're missing is the psychology aspect of it, all right? So there is disorders that can actually cause someone to always have anxiety, which is called anxiety disorder, which I have. More specifically, generalized anxiety disorder. That is what I have. All right. So here's the point of what they don't understand. Okay. You can't really tell, looking at me and my mannerisms, that I have anxiety disorder. You might have a slight hint if you were looking for it. If someone told you, I think he's really nervous, he's moving his hands a lot, he's doing this, he's doing that, then you watch me, then you're going to think, oh, of course he has anxiety disorder. But if you never heard that and you're just watching me without having that in your mind, you're not looking for it, you're probably not going to think that. So the thought is what will help influence an opinion like that. And that's what they're not really understanding. All right. So it's like I said, a lie detector test is extremely flawed. You know, just especially someone with anxiety disorder probably couldn't pass the lie detector test under any circumstances. All right? Because they could ask you what your name is and it could say you're lying. Even though they know for a fact we know who you are and you told us the truth, lie detector test says you're lying. That's why they're not admissible in court. You know what I'm saying? If they were accurate enough, they would be admissible in court. All right? But they're just not. It's guesswork. It is just something to give investigators an idea. Right? And even then, I don't think it should be used. All right? And the reason why, for the investigators, it's a win-win. For the suspect, it's a lose-lose. And I'm going to tell you why. For the suspect, if it says he's lying, that's a win for the investigators. if it says he's telling the truth, then the investigators are going to say, well, they're not that accurate. So he could have been lying, but fooled so he could have been lying the whole time, but the lie detector test just didn't pick it up. He's just really good at lying. That's why we didn't get anything out of this. So, win-win for the investigators, lose-lose for the suspect. All right. It is not a good idea. And I think, because they even picked up on his negative gesture as he was saying, sure, I'll take a lie detector test. And I think they wrongfully diagnosed that gesture because he was starting to realize, if I do that, that's going to help sink my boat. Even though he's saying, yeah, I'll do it, I got nothing to hide, and hoping that that truth will be upheld during that process. But then he also has negative feelings about that as well, because he knows, it's a lose-lose for him, right? He knows the police are biased against him. He knows that. So he's really afraid of giving them any ammunition to target him with, right? That's the biggest problem here. That's what they didn't pick up on. They kind of did. I mean, they did mention the fact that he would have resentment for the police. He would be overly paranoid about having fingers pointed at him. They briefly mentioned that. But I don't think they took it serious enough. You know what I'm saying? I mean, doing 18 years for something you didn't do, that's a hard pill to swallow. That is, if we were talking about 6 months, that's totally different. You know what I'm saying? You could get over that a lot easier. But you do 18 years? So they unlawfully took 18 years from him. So he's going to have an enormous amount of resentment, especially for that police department. These are the same people that had to do with my case in the past. Here they are again questioning me over an even more serious case. The other thing I want to point out, and it's something a lot of people, I've heard it once, and when I heard it, I was like, are you serious? Like, I didn't even think about that. Who gets 18 years for an assault? So you guys should know exactly what I'm talking about when I say assault, right? But look, who gets 18 years for that? And also keep in mind, he was only released because he was found to be innocent. So he still had more time on the books to do. So I'm thinking about looking into that and seeing generally what kind of time you get for it. Now, I understand you should get a lot of time for that. That is a horrible thing to do. All right. But 18 years? I'm pretty sure usually murder gets way less than that. I think, I don't know, maybe 10 to 15? Well, you guys let me know if that sounds right. I'm not totally for sure, but either way, we're going to look into it. All right. Because you know, from what I can see, like this police department just hated the Averys. All right, they just hated it. You know, and that's something else that they should look into. Look into the police department. You know, I've been in, Facebook groups talking about this. Someone in there brought up a good point. They should do an analysis on Ken Kratz, on the prosecutors, on all kinds of interviews about this case, right? In order to get a better scope, a better view of what was going on.
Scott, what do you got?
This is where I think we start seeing. I did a whole thing on him being a psychopath and why I believe he is. On a whole video that's 6 minutes long. But this is one of the first things that I think cue us off that start looking for psychopathy in this situation. Because right there when he said when something happened, he's saying he doesn't know what it was, but apparently something horrible. We're seeing him talk about feelings and things without naming the feelings. And I think he's not naming the feelings because he doesn't know what they are. He doesn't understand what feelings are. A lot of times you'll have examples of and I'm sure we've all dealt with this where we're talking to a psychopath and they'll start taking those things we're saying. If something makes us angry, I think Greg, I've told you the story about the guy when I was talking about taxes once, and then hearing him later on in a restaurant, one in the booth right behind me talking about that. I was like, oh my God, because he was using the same descriptive terms I was and he ended up, he'd done some really horrible stuff, which we're still trying to catch him now. And that guy ended up being a psychopath. We're seeing the beginnings of the hallmarks of the psychopath here when he can't describe what feelings are. So since Mark covered all what he was saying and stuff.
So when it comes to that, I think it could be him being overly paranoid. All right. And I'm going to give you an example that I've experienced myself. Okay. So when I used to drive, what I would do, since the left lane was usually a lot less traffic in there, I would get in the left lane and just cruise. There was nothing in the book that said I couldn't do that. Okay? Nothing at all. So one night, and keep in mind, my rearview mirror had fallen off. Okay? So I didn't have a rearview mirror. So I didn't have a really good picture of what was going on behind me. Well, all of a sudden, I see headlights really bright behind me in my side mirrors. So I look in my side mirror and I'm like, this guy is really close to my bumper. So I speed up some. Well, he speeds up too. I'm like, what is wrong with this guy? Like, he's got a serious problem here. Well, if we're on the interstate, we end up coming around a curve, and I looked back because I kept checking my mirror to see how close he was. It was a cop. So then the anxiety and the panic starts setting in, right? Because I don't know, is he about to pull me over? Is he doesn't like something about my car? What's going on? You know, why is he acting this way? So then I think there's a spot to my right. I think I'll merge and get out of the way. But then I thought, if I do that, I might be looking suspicious. He might think, he's trying to avoid me. Now I'm going to pull him over. And keep in mind, I did not have insurance at the time. No insurance. So I really didn't want to get pulled over. I mean, with every bit of my being, I was like, I can't get pulled over. I can't, right? But that's why I got pulled over. Was because I didn't merge and let him pass. So I thought if I just hold this lane, try not to speed, I kept adjusting my speed. So he kept getting closer and closer, right? And just like tailgating. And I'm like, what is this guy's problem? So then eventually I thought, well, if I just hold this lane, try to keep from speeding, because I know if I go too fast, he's going to pull me over for speeding, right? And I was like, I just want to keep this guy from hitting me. But I think if I merge, he'll definitely pull me over. He did. Well, he pulls me over. He walks up to the car and he says, don't you think holding the left lane like that was a bonehead move? You're just trying to hold me up, keep me from doing my job. And I was like, what are you talking about? And I was like, that was not my intention at all. And I told him, I didn't know I couldn't do that. I really didn't. All right. But he eventually explained it, that the left lane is for passing and emergency vehicles. It's not for us to just hold on the left lane. You know what I'm saying? No one ever told me that. But I'd heard it's an unwritten rule, like everyone's supposed to know. Well, I didn't know. No one told me. Okay? But look, once he found out I had no insurance, like his whole demeanor changed. I think at that point he realized this guy was just really nervous and didn't know what to do. There you go. That is a perfect example of what I think we're seeing here. He is so nervous, he's sweating bullets because he thinks no matter what I do, they're going to get it. All right. So he's overthinking everything. I think what's happening here is that he's afraid to say, I am angry, I am pissed off. He's afraid to show his true emotion, that he is furious that they're looking at him for this. Because you got to think, in his mind, right, I'm innocent. Why are they looking at me? Why are they not, going out there and looking for her? Because remember, at that time, she was still missing during this interview. So why are they wasting time with me and not going out there and looking for her to see where she is, what's going on? They're here focused on me. That is what I think is happening. All right. I think it makes a lot of sense for him to feel that way. But he thinks if he shows that he is furious, that he's angry, he's really ticked off, he's all these other things, and if he had showed all that, would the panelists have looked at that and said, this guy's a raging psychopath? Just like detectives and the cops. What would they have thought if they looked at that and it clearly showed his true emotion, that was anger and rage? This guy's a psychopath. Of course he did it. He's a raging lunatic. That, I think, could be why he didn't want to show his true emotion. He didn't want to name what emotion he was feeling. It makes sense, because he's worried if I show any emotion, if I show any connection to her. That's the other thing. A strong connection to a victim, sometimes they can use that as an indication that this might be our suspect. Because if you remember, they always go for the boyfriend first, right? I always love boyfriends. for, you know what I'm saying? So it could be that he just didn't want to fully explain how he felt about her because he was worried if I say that I liked her, she was really nice. We had a good friendship. You know, he could have thought if I say any of that, that's going to be used against me. It's very possible. So now we're going to look at another analysis that was actually a much better analysis than this. Now, you know, I want to think these guys didn't get this wrong on purpose. I want to think that, you know, they don't have all the details. If they had more of the details on the case, then a lot of his behaviors would make a lot more sense and give credibility to the fact that he didn't do it. Him and Brendan also. They didn't do it. Right. That is what I think about the case so far. I cannot imagine it going down the way they said it did. All right. Also, another thing that I think about is the timeline. How much time it would have taken Brendan and Stephen to commit the crime and then to burn everything and have, you know, I've brought this up before. Apparently, there was someone there that was close enough to tell it was them two that was managing a huge bonfire. And supposedly, that was them cleaning up the crime scene. All right. I'm trying not to be too descriptive because I am on YouTube. You know what I'm saying? But look, that is a huge red flag for me because I know when you dispose of someone like that, it creates a horrible smell. And like, you know, immediately something is wrong. That is not normal materials they're burning over there, and I want to know what it is. All right. Look, I seriously don't think it went down the way they said it did. All right. So that's part of it. Then, I could only imagine how long that smell would have stayed in the air. Right? I have no idea about that, but I'm sure some of you guys might comment on it. But then you have the crime scene itself, how long it would have taken them to clean up everything. All right. I just don't see it. I really don't. You know, you're telling me that all that happened on that bed, and they got that same bed cleaned up perfect. So it's been a while since I've watched Forensic Files. All right, but they do have a spray that they can spray down surfaces, and then they use a light. I think it's luminol. All right, and then it'll light up when it detects bodily fluids. Which, even still, so it'll still light up, even if it's been cleaned with bleach. It'll still light up. Look, there's just no way. There is no way. Like, did they even do that test? That's what I want to know. because and I like the explanation Kathleen Zellner gave when she looked at the garage. It had looked like it had farm equipment, it had tractors, it had stuff all over the place, right? We're talking billions and billions of spots where blood could have gotten to. All right. When you shoot a person where there's that much area around for the spatter to go, there would have been spatter on everything. Everything. All right. No possible way that there was no blood spatter found in it. It's ridiculous. They would have had to pull a Dexter move and, get the whole area covered in plastic. Is what they would have had to do. Oh, right. Which is not what they did, apparently. All right. I mean, it is. The whole thing is absurd. The other thing that I want to look at is who else lived on that property in that vicinity, right? So I know Stephen had a trailer there. I know Brendan and his mom, I believe, had a trailer that was close to his. And I think most of everyone else went out trick-or-treating, right? But I couldn't imagine them going out trick-or-treating for more than 5 or 6 hours. But that's what I'd like to know, exactly how long did they have to commit that crime and get all the evidence cleaned up. The other thing, supposedly, there were burn pits with, evidence in the burn pits just left there. When you have other people that live on that property that could have easily walked over and saw that and went, hey, wait a minute. This is not normal. What's in your burn pit, buddy? Does that make any sense? There is just so many things. The other thing, too, she came there all the time, right? So why would he pick her? And why would he pick her on a day that she had just been to his house? And that everyone knew that. They had an appointment. So why would he do that right then? Doesn't make any sense. Now, they want to bring up his IQ when we're talking about this specifically, right? That's beyond ridiculous. Okay. What we're talking about here is common sense. All right. And I think he has a great deal of common sense. All right. I truly believe he would have known. Like, if he really did that, I think he would have known. This is not a good idea. They're immediately going to look at me. Right? And plus he already knew that police station didn't like him. So why would he willfully create a situation to where he's a prime target in a murder case? It doesn't make any sense. He also supposedly either pushed or dragged or whatever, but got the RAV4 over by the crushing machine, but didn't crush it. How much sense does that make? How long does it take to crush a car? Seconds. That's how long it takes. You're telling me they couldn't afford seconds to crush that car and bury it, or do something with it, or put it into a large pile of cars? You see what I'm saying? Personally, I think they probably would have just buried it. They probably had tractors and bulldozers. So I think that's probably, like, if they really did that, they probably would have crushed that car and buried it amongst a whole bunch of other cars. All right. So it just doesn't make any sense, y'all. They brought it all the way over there and then thought, I'll just cover it with a few sticks and branches and think that's going to be enough. It's just really bizarre, you know. So I would like to see a really good timeline of when they started searching the property and when they started actually finding evidence. In the burn pit, when they found I know they searched a bunch of times in that trailer. And after a bunch of times, they finally found the key. It doesn't work. It really does. I think when everyone was gone one night, someone snuck in and put that evidence there. Then when they came back, then they found it. Then they have this miraculous story about they shook a dresser or something and it fell out of something. I don't remember exactly where I heard that, but put in the comments if you know where that was said. All right. Because that's something I would like to, because I could have got it wrong exactly what they said, but that was my impression when I heard that. All right. I was just like, it is so implausible that you shook a dresser and a key falls out. Falls out of where? You know what I'm saying? Falls out of a drawer? Was it underneath a stack of papers and then it fell out? What? And why were you shaking the dresser? Was it a vending machine that didn't give you your snacks? What was it? You know what I'm saying? Were you frustrated because you weren't finding something and you're just shaking it back and forth? Give me information. And then the key falls out. What exactly was he doing? Why was he shaking the dresser or the desk or whatever it was? That's not a normal thing. All right? So, I don't know. All right. Let's go ahead and check out a better, more thorough analysis. So this is coming from Dr. Brand. I hope I pronounced your name right. All right. So I'm going to focus on the beginning and the end. But just know, at the beginning, he talks about a lot of concerning factors. Factors that shouldn't be overlooked, but at the same time taken with a grain of salt. Because a lot of them are just rumors and we don't know the truth. We don't know exactly what happened. All right. As far as I know, Stephen has never gave explicit details as to what was going on with the cat. All right. I know he's talked about it, but I don't have the full story. I will say this. I hope that situation did not happen the way the rumors say it did. All right. I hope Stephen did not do that. If that story is true, then there are some major psychological issues with Stephen. All right. If that is the case, does that mean, oh, of course he did? No, it doesn't mean that at all. It just means that he has some psychopathic tendencies, is what I would call it. I'm no expert, okay, so don't take that to heart. Take it with a grain of salt, because that's my opinion. That someone who could do that, to a living creature, could have the potential to take that a few steps further. If that makes any sense. All right. But, and he does address that, by the way. And I've watched this whole video as well, and I believe he says that it is a rumor and we don't have the whole truth. I believe he says that, but don't hold me to it if he don't.
Avery case in terms of personality, mental health, behavioral components. This case was made popular by the Making a Murder series. Now, of course, Steven Avery and the other people I'll be talking about in this video are real people. So just a reminder that I'm not making any diagnosis, rather just speculating on what could be happening in a case like this. So,
another thing I want to point out, supposedly he's such a raging psychopath, and yet those two people that were with him testified against him and turned him in and caused him to be found guilty. All right. And yet, he doesn't do anything to them. But he's such a raging psychopath that he would just do that to a cat for no reason at all. Just, let's do something crazy. And then supposedly they testify against him, right? And he doesn't retaliate. I find that hard to believe. I really do.
Steven Avery is a convicted murderer, as I mentioned, made popular by this documentary series. And the case is extremely complex. So I'm going to give a summary here, but it is important to note that there's a massive amount of information available on this case, because really it spans all the way from 1985 till the present. So as I mentioned, Steven Avery is a convicted murderer. He was a resident of Manitowoc County, Wisconsin. He was born in 1962. His family owns and operates a salvage yard, and that's where he grew up. He was shown to be a fairly poor student growing up, and it's alleged his IQ is around 70, which is 2 standard deviations below the mean. So to put that in perspective, in terms of his percentile rank, if his IQ is indeed 70, he would be at about the 2nd percentile. That means that about 98% of the population would have an IQ higher than Steven Avery. Now we know in his early years he did have some difficulties with the law, and I'll look at that a little later on in the video when I look at the evidence that points toward guilt and points toward innocence in this case. Now, as I mentioned, this all starts in 1985, and this is a really complex timeline because we're really talking about 2 separate events here. So in 1985, a woman was assaulted in Manitowoc County on the beach the beach on Lake Michigan. And Avery had an alibi during the time that this assault was taking place, yet he was still arrested and convicted. And involved in this was kind of a suspicious police sketch and some animosity that appears that the police department may have had toward Steven Avery. So as I mentioned, he was convicted and he was sentenced to prison. While in prison in 2002, new DNA testing became available and a new suspect was identified by his lawyers based on this DNA testing. They were trying to exonerate Avery. The new suspect was named Gregory Allen. Allen had assaulted someone on that same beach, that Lake Michigan beach, in 1983, and was under police surveillance because they were worried he would commit a crime against a woman. So he was kind of a good suspect for this 1985 assault. However, in 1985, Allen was never a suspect, and that victim never saw him in a lineup. Also, Allen and Avery kind of looked alike. So there were a few reasons here why Avery was convicted. It wasn't necessarily all like a conspiracy or the police having something against him. There was this similarity in terms of appearance. But either way, it appears that Allen was responsible for the 1985 assault, but he was already in prison for another assault by the time we get to 2002. So Avery was exonerated and released from prison in 2003, and he started a civil suit against the county and the district attorney at the time he was convicted, and this civil suit was for $36 million. Now moving to 2005, this civil suit is going on. It's not settled, but it's ongoing. We see that a photographer for Auto Trader, 25-year-old Teresa Halbach, goes missing, and her last appointment was at the Avery salvage yard. She was there to take a picture of a vehicle that Avery wanted to sell for his sister. At least that's what was said by Steven Avery. Now, Avery, of course, became a suspect right away, and we see quite a bit of physical evidence that was collected, and this confession from Avery's nephew.
Another thing I would like to find out, what time was it that she should have left their property? And what time was it when she was first reported as missing? I think, logically speaking, if those two things happened, within a few hours of each other, then it starts to look more likely that they did do this. All right? Because that narrows down the window of this happening to her. Does that make any sense? So, if they didn't do this, right? Like, that was not her last stop. She had somewhere else she was going. She leaves there, she goes somewhere else, and then that happens, right? So I think we all know that Steven was one of the last people she saw. All right. The question becomes, what else was she planning to do during the day? Was she planning on taking those pictures and then going home? That's what I'd like to find out. Or was she planning on going to the grocery store, doing some shopping, running some other errands, going to pay some bills somewhere, right? That would be some good information to have. Because then they could start asking, did she make it to those places? Now, of course, that investigation's long over now. Like, there's no way they could verify any of that. Which I think is a shame, because that would have been a good place to start. Talk to her family. What else was she planning to do today? Do you have any idea? Did she mention, hey, what do you want from the grocery store while I'm there? I'm going to the Averys to take some pictures, then I'm going to, Kroger's to get some groceries. Or I'm going to go get some pictures developed. Or whatever else. And that takes so long, and I'll be sitting there waiting for them to, get developed. Or whatever else, right? So, where is any of that information? Or is it that she was going to do that, she was going to come right back? I'm sure she probably would have told her family something. I don't know exactly who she was living with, but I'm sure they probably would have heard something about what time she would be home. So that's a great question there, right? And I think that's important for us to know. Because if we're going to try to understand the timeline, like that would be really helpful. And what would go into that is what time specifically was it brought to their attention that someone is missing. All right. So, for example, this interview that we just looked at, what date and time was that taken? I would like to go back and see if that was time-stamped in the video. I think it should be, right? But either way, I would like to build like a really good timeline. So we know this supposedly happened on Halloween. At what point was she reported missing? At what point did he start getting interviews and all that kind of stuff and go on from there? What day they found the RAV4? Like everything like that. I want to know, I want to have a really good picture of the timeline of what was going on.
So now I'll take a look at some of the factors that I think kind of point toward guilt, some that point toward innocence, and then give my thoughts on this case in terms of Steven Avery and whether he did it or not. Of course, I don't know, but I'll give my thoughts.
Now, this right here is a great example of what the behavioral panel should have done, right? Not just look at the case in one lens. From the perspective that, okay, this looks wrong, this looks wrong, this looks wrong, this is telling us it's likely that he committed this crime. Did it consider any of the defense's arguments? So I think that is a faulty analysis right there. It's only telling one side of the story. What this guy does here, he does a much better job of looking at the negatives and the positives. All right. I think we already know most of the negatives surrounding this case. And we're already over an hour in. Now my commentary is going to be sped up a little bit. All right. Just to keep the runtime from being over an hour long. I'm going to try to keep it to an hour. All right.
And we see there's a hole in the top of the vial. Now, this was explained in his trial. There was somebody who indicated that they used a hypodermic needle and punctured it. So there was some explanation for this, but still, this doesn't look good. And the last element that I'll mention here that points toward innocence is the confession of Brendan Dassey, right? He was young. Evidently, he also had a fairly low IQ, again, rumored to be around 70. And if you look at the confession, the video is available for this, and it was included, partially at least, in this documentary I mentioned before. It does really look coerced. There have been different rulings on this. Right now, as I mentioned, he has not been successful in appeals, but there was a favorable ruling for him before that was undone later on by another ruling. But either way, this confession really does appear to be coerced. We see that the officers are giving him ideas almost like he didn't really know what to say, and they were kind of telling him what to say. Now, there are other bits of information in that confession that he produced where it does seem like he would have had to have been involved in the murder to know that information, but still, the police were really pressing. He was 16 at the time, I believe, and again, we have that low IQ potentially at work.
We also have to remember that they had had many interviews with him before that. All right. They could have very easily told him and fed him that information. This is what we want you to say when we ask you. You're going to say this. All right. That is what I believe happened. These interrogators were not going by the book at all. I've watched interrogations. That is not how it's done. All right. They are allowed to lie. But there's boundaries to that. Okay? They cannot feed them information. They can't do it. They have to ask open-ended questions. All right. From what I've seen, they just kept asking leading questions. Which is not how it's done. All right. There's this really good reason for that. So the reason why you don't do that is so that their confession can be validated. All right. The best validation is when a suspect tells you, I can tell you where this evidence is and where that evidence is. And they go there and they discover that specific evidence. That is corroborating the confession. We obviously don't have that here. All right. But suppose that example I just gave you. Suppose that suspect had to have been fed that information before he could tell it back to them. Right? Instead of them saying, okay, where is the murder weapon? Right? Instead of saying that, what if they said, where's the murder weapon? You threw it in the pond, right? Did you throw it in the pond? I know you threw it in the pond. Just tell me so we can move on to something else. You threw it in the pond, right? And just keep on and on until he says, yes, I threw it in the pond, okay? There you go. That is not corroborating the confession. That is simply agreeing with what they told you to say. All right? You can't do that. I don't know how in the world any judge looked at that confession and said, oh yeah, this is totally fine. Something is wrong. All right? There's lots of confessions on YouTube. If you guys disagree and think that's totally fine, find another confession. Any other confession where the investigators are feeding them information, whether it's true or not, right? Just do that. Put in the comments and we'll take a look at it. All right? But just know that is not how you're supposed to do it. If they had done it correctly and didn't give him any information whatsoever, if every single detail came from him, we would be having a much different conversation. That's on the investigators.
So this is really, I think, something that points toward innocence. I think this confession kind of works against the police department and in a way works for Steven Avery. So what are my thoughts on this case? What's my analysis of the Steven Avery case? We know that many people have been influenced pretty strongly by the Making a Murderer series, and it's really quite convincing. When you watch the first season, the first 10 episodes, you kind of leave thinking that Steven Avery must be innocent. So beyond just not guilty, beyond a reasonable doubt, but innocent. Well, I think it's important to look at all the evidence. The documentary series, I think, is pretty good, but it does leave out some important elements. It seems to include everything that pointed toward innocence, and it fails to include some of the things that pointed toward guilt. Right? The way the testimony was kind of featured in the documentary, it wasn't complete. They didn't really have everything there, and the order seemed to be changed around in terms of what really happened in the trial. But either way, we see that,
Now, I'm sure a lot of you guys are way more familiar with it than I am. Let me know if he's correct on that. All right.
indicated, not guilty is different than innocent, right? So not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, the standard that Steven Avery was judged by in that trial, is different than being truly innocent, right? They're different constructs. So if one is to believe that the police planted the key in this case, right? Here are my thoughts on this. If someone's to believe that they planted the key, that they were capable of something like that they were motivated strongly enough to do that, then seemingly all of the other evidence really doesn't seem to matter a lot, because who knows what else they did, right? The investigation gets tainted at that point. Now, I've seen this argument before that says the police planted the key, but they couldn't have planted the other evidence. But again, once the investigation is tainted, I believe that alone is reasonable doubt, right? So in terms of, is he guilty beyond a reasonable doubt? No, I don't think so, because that whole issue with the key just seems so suspicious, and you only need one reasonable doubt for someone to be not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. So for me, this is actually enough to say, in my opinion anyway, I believe he was not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. I've also seen the argument that the police believed he was guilty and that he was actually guilty, and they just wanted to make sure he was found guilty. But I think this is the same problem, a bad investigation. Maybe Avery was a good suspect, but what if somebody else was a better suspect? We'll never know, because the police didn't follow up. They didn't check out other suspects, at least not to any serious degree. So we'll never know if the other suspects had a motive, opportunity, what evidence might be involved that connects them. We'll never really see any of that. We only see what Avery's potential involvement was. So we just get this one side of the picture. Now, again, I indicated reasonable doubt's different than innocence. So do I believe he's innocent? Well, this gets a little trickier, right? Because this isn't a matter of like an opinion based on the standard that a court would use, but rather just thinking about the evidence, what they call preponderance of evidence. Well, for the first time Avery was accused, I'm talking about the 1985 assault, I do believe he was innocent there. It makes sense that Gregory Allen committed that crime. I don't know if Allen did, but it just makes sense that he would have been a much better suspect there. Now, I think really with this 1985 case, what we have with Steven Avery is more than just him being innocent, but rather a horrible miscarriage of justice. I think here he was wronged. I think that the police really did some horrendous acts to get him wrongly convicted. I don't think there's really any getting around that. The police still maintain, some of them, that they think he may have committed that crime, which just seems so ridiculous when given the evidence that exonerated him. Now, moving to the 2005 murder of Teresa Halbach, this is a lot different. Here he seems like the logical suspect. He had the means, opportunity, a history consistent with violence, although he didn't have a history, of course, of murder. And one would have to overlook a substantial amount of evidence, or one would have to believe that the police framed him in order to believe he was innocent. So at this case, the 2005 case, I just don't know. I would probably lean toward the simplest answer is usually the correct answer, Occam's razor here, which would point toward Avery being guilty. The logic here is someone had to do it, and most of the evidence points toward Avery. But at the same time, it's not unthinkable that one or two police officers could have.
The circumstantial evidence is what he's talking about there. All right. It's what I'm getting from that. That was one of the last places she was at. All right. And the reason why I say that is because the physical evidence, as he's just said, was tainted. That's quite obvious. So he's not using that to say that. He's talking about circumstantial evidence. That was one of the last places she ever visited. Okay. We don't know how many other places she might have went if that wasn't her last place. All right. If that was her last place that she ever went, keeping in mind she was only going there to take pictures. And then supposedly she was going to come right back in this scenario, because we don't know. But let's just imagine for a moment that she says, hey, I'm going to the Averys to take pictures, I'll be right back. She goes up there, she takes the pictures. After an hour passed, when she was supposed to be home, you'd imagine they might start calling her phone and texting her and saying, hey, where are you at? Especially because supposedly they had some conflicts before, and she kind of felt weirded out by them, right? Because he answered the door in a towel one time, right? So you would think they would be getting pretty nervous really quick, right? It's now 3 hours past and she's still not home. She went to the Averys. At what point do they call the police and say, hey, something's wrong? She went to the Averys and now I can't get a hold of her. It's been, 4 or 5 hours or whatever, right? I would imagine that call would happen pretty quick, within a few hours of her not coming home when she was expected and not answering her phone. And that's a detail I don't think anyone else has ever mentioned. You know what I'm saying? At what point was she reported missing?
Here, and could have framed Stephen Avery. It's not that most police officers are corrupt. We know the evidence actually supports that most are honest and do a good job. They're as honest as the general population anyway.
Not all
but in
of
my
them.
clinical experience working with clients who have had a lot of interactions with law enforcement, working with law enforcement directly, working with the friends and family of clients who've been involved with the criminal justice system, even though I would still say that most of the interactions are positive, we do see some trends that could support this theory in the Stephen Avery case that the police framed him. For one thing, I've seen that mental health and the law don't mix well together, and that would connect to this
Right.
case if one were to believe that Avery had mental health issues or extreme personality characteristics. Now, I don't know if he did or he does, but either way, if one were to believe that, mental health and the law do not mix well together. And the concern here is that law enforcement are usually considered a tight-knit group, and even normally good officers might overlook the bad acts of other officers because they want to demonstrate their loyalty, or they believe that a suspect is really guilty, so they're not doing anything wrong by making that suspect look more guilty, right? And I've seen this a few times. They don't want to be made an outsider either, right? An officer who's a good officer, when approached by a bad officer, that good officer wants to be a member of the team. They want to play along. So they get tempted.
That's what I was talking about at the beginning of the video. You know what I'm saying? I was talking about that.
To behave in a way that would be criminal. Again, many members of law enforcement tend to stick together, and their unwillingness to get out of this case with Steven Avery just doesn't look good. I mentioned that before. So, again, I don't know if he did it or not. I lean a little bit toward the idea that he did do it, but there are a lot of factors here that point the other direction too. As with all cases kind of similar to this is a tragedy either way, right? There was a horrible murder committed here. That's a tragedy. And maybe Steven Avery is sitting in prison and he's not guilty. Who knows? But this is a tragic situation. This is certainly one of the most interesting cases that I've seen in examining a lot of cases over the years. We have someone here who's wrongly accused, convicted, then exonerated, then arrested again, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison. So certainly, again, an interesting case and an unusual case, to say the least. So I know whenever I talk about cases like this, in particular, the cases that are really controversial, and certainly this case qualifies as a controversial case, I know that there are going to be different opinions, people who agree or disagree with me, who have other opinions about this case. Please put those opinions in the comments. They always generate a really interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found this analysis of the Steven Avery case to be interesting. Thanks for watching.
Now, overall, he did give a pretty good analysis here, all right? Even though he said he leans a little bit more towards guilt, he also understands there's a lot of factors that points towards innocence. I mean, a lot. All right. You know, and as far as that goes, I think he did a really good job of talking about the issues with the investigation in general. Right. So, all right, that's it for now, y'all.